Hello there. My name is Jen Wolosin, and I am the Vice Mayor of Menlo Park. And it is Saturday, May 14th, 2022. And I'm here to walk you through Menlo Park's housing element draft. I am speaking as an individual today. My viewpoints and perspectives are mine alone and do not represent those of the Menlo Park City Council. I also want to let you know that I am not a housing expert. I am a self-taught housing interested resident like you, and I may have some errors, but I've done my best to be as accurate as possible. So if you do see anything that doesn't look right, please let me know. But I'm going to go through today and talk about the newly released draft housing element that is quite meaty. So let's go. So first, let's start. What is a housing element? And I'm only going to spend one moment here, but essentially it's a state mandate from the state of California, where each city in California has to plan for a certain amount of housing every 8 years. So the city of Menlo Park is finishing our cycle 5 housing element, where we were required to plan for 655 housing units. And we are entering our cycle 6 housing element, which means we need to plan for about 3,000 housing units. Actually more, because the state is highly recommending a buffer in case some of the sites aren't used. So the map on the right just shows the amount that each city in the Bay Area has to plan for. I'm going to stop for just a moment and let you know that I created a video back in September 2021 that really does an overview of the housing element and kind of gives you a housing element 101, and especially the affordable housing issues raised in the challenging housing element we have coming up. So if you are not familiar with that information, I encourage you to stop for a minute and educate yourself either by watching my earlier video or by visiting our city's housing element webpage, where there's lots of information. So moving forward, I'm going to assume that everyone is up to date on what the housing element is. And here are some key dates. So the housing element kicked off about a year ago, May 25th, where the City Council had our first housing element discussion. And now, after about a year of work, the housing element draft is being released for public comment, and we are in the midst of a 30-day review period. And residents and stakeholders have until June 10th, 2022 to submit any feedback on the draft that we're about to look at. And then our city is required to have an approved housing element to the state by January 2023. So we have about a half year to finish this. And in that time, we need to complete our environmental impact report, a fiscal impact analysis. Then we need to submit it to the state for review and ultimately get acceptance. Once that happens, we need to rezone and implement the policies and programs outlined in our housing element. And then annually, we're required to give a progress report to the state. So what's inside the 708-page draft that was just released a couple days ago? Quite a bit of information. So there's an evaluation of the last cycle's housing element. There's a description of what's going on in Menlo Park with regards to housing. There's a discussion about affirmatively furthering fair housing and how fair housing is in Menlo Park. It talks about the constraints of why it's hard to build housing in Menlo Park. There's a list of sites that are being considered for this housing element, and goals, policies, and programs that need to be implemented in order to enable the housing to be built. And then there's a lot of appendices and a lot more information for those of you who want more. So let's start with the first category, which is the 5th cycle evaluation. So that section talks about the progress that the City of Menlo Park made in terms of meeting its last RHNA, and RHNA stands for Regional Housing Needs Allocation. That's the number of housing units by income level that the City of Menlo Park is responsible for enabling. And in the last housing cycle, cycle 5, we had that 655 number that we had to hit. And we actually went way over so far. But you can see here in the income category that we're way over in the above moderate, which is also known as market rate housing, and we're way below, in the moderate, so that missing middle housing. And then we're doing fairly well with some of the other income categories because we still have another year. So it's just interesting to note what is being built and what's not. And then also in this section, there's a list of the programs and policies from the last housing element and how the implementation of those are going, and whether it is recommended that in this upcoming housing element, we retain those policies, change those policies, or take them out altogether. So another big section in the housing element is a review of the housing conditions and trends, and really what's going on in Menlo Park with regards to our housing, especially with regards to different populations that we have, where people are working, the age of our housing stock, and how affordable it is. And there's a lot of really interesting information here. So those that kind of like learning about cities and the makeup and the demographics, this is a good section to pay attention to. But I pulled out a couple of interesting tidbits here. One is that 35.4% of Menlo Park households are what is known as rent burdened. That means they're paying more than 30% of their income on housing. That 96% of workers that work in Menlo Park don't live here. They commute in. Some obviously do that by choice. A lot do that because they can't afford to live here. And we have an older, aging housing stock. 52% of our housing was built before 1960. So there's just a lot of good information here that kind of sets the stage for the situation with housing in Menlo Park. Another big section in the housing element, and there's a lot of really interesting maps and data, especially in the appendices on this topic, is about fair housing. And the way it's defined, the requirement in the housing element for cities with regards to fair housing is to take meaningful actions in addition to combating discrimination that overcome patterns of segregation and foster inclusive communities free from barriers that restrict access to opportunities based on projected characteristics. So I've highlighted just two of the maps included in this section. The map on the left shows where services are, where resources and opportunities are, and the darker the color, the more resource rich the area is. So you can see here, this is El Camino running along. So the area more in West Menlo is very rich in shops and great schools, transit, what have you. And then the lighter areas are less resource rich. Then coming over to the map on the right, it's almost completely flipped, where the percent non-white is in the areas that are less resource rich, while the areas that have the most resources have the least amount of non-whites. So this section really does a thorough job of explaining different characteristics of our city and some of our historical practices. So one of the interesting things in the housing element are, well, why do we have fair housing issues? Why do we have that disparity between where the services are and people of color, income levels, and everything? And so it goes through 4 different factors that contribute to those fair housing issues. Just proportionate housing needs. So the housing stock we have doesn't necessarily meet the need for combating fair housing issues, displacement concerns, the high cost of housing, and some transportation issues. And then for each of those factors, it identifies some issues around it, and then what type of a priority it is to address in this housing element, and then potential policies and programs that would speak to those. So I just included 2 examples here below. So for example, that one of the fair housing issues, and it's not just about race or income, it's also about what are known as special needs populations. It could be seniors, it could be people living with disabilities. There's all types of groups that have a challenge to fair housing here in Menlo Park. So one of the issues identified in the housing element is that housing that supports people aging in place. And the factor that it speaks to is the disproportionate housing need. It's a high priority. And so some of the policies and programs that are suggested in this housing element would be helping with housing rehabilitation, anti-displacement strategies, helping incentives for special needs housing, so that would be a specific senior housing, and making our ADUs have an accessibility requirement. There's obviously many more of these issues that are covered, but I just wanted to give you a preview of what is inside. Another really interesting section of the housing element is, well, what are the barriers to creating more housing in Menlo Park? And they break it into two main categories. One are governmental, so those are within the city of Menlo Park's control, and the other is non-governmental. So starting with governmental constraints, it lists quite a few. So some of the policies in our general plan might make it harder to build more housing, having to do with land use, zoning, how much we charge fees for building, how long it takes, what are the requirements we have for building, and different items. And then for each of these constraints, it talks about what the constraint is and then ways to overcome it. Because the housing element is really about presenting kind of the challenge, the problem, what have you, and then offering solutions to address those. So the example I've pulled out here is one of the constraints is our zoning standards. And our current constraint that it's identified is parking requirements make it very costly. And so a strategy that it's recommending to overcome that is to allow for greater flexibility around parking requirements, especially for special need populations, meaning that sometimes with seniors or with people living with disabilities, they may not require the same level of parking requirements that maybe multifamily housing requires for the general population. Then it lists out some non-governmental constraints to housing, a lot that would probably be familiar to a lot of us, the availability and the cost of financing, especially with interest rates going up, and then land and construction costs. And wow, for anyone who's looked to build or do a remodel or anything, construction costs are quite expensive here. One of the examples given was for a recent 140 unit multifamily affordable housing unit on Willow Road, where each unit to build was $850,000 or about $120 million in total for that 140 unit building. And that's just construction costs, not the land costs. So it is quite expensive to build housing here. So one of the suggestions that the housing element lays out is to really work with nonprofit housing developers who are able to piece together funding from different sources, who really understand the community and who have the expertise to serve different populations that need affordable housing. Okay, so let's see where we have covered and where we need to go further. So I'm going to first review what we've already talked about, which covers about the first 269 pages of this housing element draft. It talks about what's the status of housing in Menlo Park, how have we been doing, what's the current landscape, what's going on with fair housing, what are some of the issues and remedies to those, and then what are the constraints that are still present, both governmental and non-governmental. And then coming up from page 270 on is, well, what are we going to do about it? How are we going to address these challenges? Where's the housing going to go? And then what new policies and programs is Menlo Park going to implement to enable this housing to be built? So I called out a little pro tip here. So for those of you who are way up on the housing element, kind of get what the situation is and just kind of want to get to the meat of the document, figure out, where these sites are going to be and what the policies are, you can kind of jump to page 270. But just be warned that starting page 270 on, it gets very, very dense. And yeah, just be prepared for a lot of numbers. Okay, so let's get into some numbers now. And what we're going to see is that our big challenge is in that affordable housing need. So the state regional housing needs allocation, that's the amount that the state is requiring Menlo Park to plan for, with a 30% buffer that is highly recommended. The state is telling us that we need about 2161 affordable units and about 1,700 market rate or above moderate units. So this is broken down by affordability level. for a total of about 4,000 units. Our pipeline projects represent those projects that are either in the review process, that are being designed, being built. A lot of those are in District 1. SRI is actually included, even though it's not yet approved. And then ADUs, which represent about 80 or so units. So looking at kind of what Menlo Park already has under review or under construction, we hit about 3,700. So really, really close to our total need, about 97% over here. But what you see is that 97%, a lot of that comes from the above moderate. We're actually way over our need for the 8-year period already at year 0 for above moderate, but we're way below for our affordable units, especially our very low units. And very low is actually further broken down into very low and extremely low. So those are a huge challenge for us. So if you look at how many additional units we're going to need in our housing element, but above and beyond what we already have planning for in our review process, we're going to need about 1,490, about 1,500 additional units, and all of those need to be affordable. So the affordability issue is really the key focus of this housing element. So how are we going to get that 1,500 affordable units? Well, the housing element is proposing kind of 4 categories, 4 ways to yield affordable units. One is to reuse sites that were in the last housing element, and there are 14 sites that are being proposed to be reused. To use religious facilities like churches and church parking lots for housing. To use sites that have capacity for lower income housing. So these are sites potentially on public land, or that are ripe for redevelopment because the building is very old. So the housing element is looking at about 24 of those sites and expecting to get quite a bit of our affordable units from those sites. And then the last category is to look at new sites that don't necessarily look great for affordable housing, but that would be great for market rate housing. And this is where the city is thinking of using its inclusionary housing policy, where when we build market rate units, we require the developer to give about 15% of those units to affordable. So that's why in order to hit that 1,490 affordable units, we're actually looking to have to build about, or plan for 3,379, which is more, which is about double the amount of affordable units. And that's because it's going to take so many more units, both market and affordable, to get those affordable. And when you look at these numbers, remember, this is just what we're planning for, what we're enabling. It doesn't necessarily mean that all of these are going to be built and that all these are going to happen. So just to summarize, we're looking at 73 opportunity sites to build an additional about 3,000 housing units. In addition, so far we've talked about the pipeline projects that include the ADUs, the new opportunity sites that we're going to need to get those affordable units. There's another objective that the city is trying to do, which is really to revitalize our downtown area, to get what a lot of residents are looking for: more dining, entertainment, retail. And in order to have a critical mass of people downtown and people in our city to support a lot of fun retail, we're going to need even more units. And so another strategy that the city is looking at is to revitalize some of our areas by increasing our residential cap in our downtown and El Camino area, and increasing the density that's allowed. So that is planning to unlock about 621 additional market rate units. So to summarize, we were looking at the pipeline and ADUs, and this is broken out by affordable and market rate. So we first were looking at, what does Menlo Park already have in our on the table? How are we going to get those additional 1,490 affordable units? Well, we're going to need about 3,379. And then how can we also revitalize our downtown area? So about 621. So wow, we're looking at 7,729 planned for potential of additional housing units, broken out by about 2,624 affordable and 5,105. So let's just take a deep breath here. That's a lot. In 2021, there were 14,124 housing units in Menlo Park. And now this housing element would unlock the potential of basically a growth of 50%. So I do want to say that the housing element is an enabling tool. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's all going to be built. And we kind of, I believe the city is enabling more than it expects to yield to allow that opportunity to come forward. So how do we figure out where this housing is going to go? This is a map that's in the housing element of the opportunity sites that the housing element is planning for. And it's tricky because a site has to be a certain size to qualify for especially affordable housing. It's kind of a Goldilocks situation. It can't be too small, so it can't be under a half an acre, and it can't be too big. It can't be over 10 acres. Also, in order to affirmatively further fair housing, which is a requirement in this cycle of the housing element, it needs to be in a high resource area, and it has to be likely to redevelop in 8 years. So for each of the sites, including each of those 73 sites included in the housing element, the city has produced a site sheet, and it's a 2-page site sheet for every single one of those 73 sites. And the first page of the site sheet contains a map of where it's located, what council district and school district it can be found in, how large it is, what the current zoning on that site is, what the assessed value is, what the existing use is, and some information that is required by the state. So you can see here, site number 1 is the Safeway Shopping Center that we all know. And then on the second page of the site sheet, so this is again for Safeway, it has a lot of analysis and information about the likelihood of it being redeveloped, how many units by affordability level that could potentially come from that site, what past evidence there is that a site just like that has switched over from its current use to a housing or mixed use. Some of the regional market trends and conditions about development, some incentives that would be required, like policies or streamlining that may be needed in order to enable that housing to be built, and then some other findings for city council consideration and for community consideration. So I encourage you, if there are specific sites that you are interested in learning more about, to flip through this section of the housing element and see what's being proposed. So overall, there are 7 goals for this housing element. And I'm not going to read each one, but you can read about them in the housing element. But essentially, the policies and programs that are listed in the housing element are to support those 7 goals. And so for each of those goals, they're written out in the housing element. So let's look at 2 of them. So this is goal H1, and it's to continue to build local government institutional capacity and monitor accomplishments to effectively respond to housing needs. So for each goal in the housing element, it lists out the policies and the programs that would support that goal. So here's a policy to help to have the city recognize that affordable housing is a priority and to work multi-jurisdictionally. So those would be policies the city would be looking to implement. Here's another goal, goal H7, design of housing, to ensure that new housing is well designed and addresses the needs of the city. So again, this has policies. So for this one, it would be to look for, review proposed new housing to achieve excellence in development design through an efficient process and encourage infill development. So it has some policies here, and it also has some programs. And for each of the programs, it says whose responsibility it is, how it's going to get paid for, what the objectives of it, and then what are the timelines or deadlines around implementing that program. So this one is to create residential design standards. So to create some objective design standards for each residential district. It says who's going to do it, where the money is going to come from. And then this one says it's going to start 2 years after the housing element, within 2 years of when the housing element is adopted. So that takes up a lot of the binder here, but there's even more pages in the housing element, a lot of appendices that have a lot of maps, definitions, information about the outreach that took place, more tables about affirmatively furthering fair housing, a lot of info. So don't be intimidated by the length of the housing element draft. A lot of it are these appendices that just dive deeper. So I've given you a quick overview of the housing element, but this is really about our residents and stakeholders and about you and what you're interested in looking at and understanding more in the housing element. So how do you focus when it's such a large document? Well, what are you trying to understand? So if you're trying to understand how did our city get to the situation it is with housing and what are our challenges and needs with regards to housing, then you probably want to focus on the first part of the housing element, pages 1 through 266. If you want to understand more about the numbers of, what was that? We need about 7,000 units, or which ones are in the pipeline and which ones are new sites, and how are we revitalizing? That's kind of that really meaty section. And so those are pages 270 through 308. If you want to understand how likely it is that any one site is going to be redeveloped, you'd want to look at the site sheets, pages 562 through 708. If you want to understand, well, what are the policies and programs that the city is looking to implement in the next few years to enable this housing, those are really the ones that speak to the goals. You want to look at pages 309 to 340. And then if you just want to spend a lot of time looking at maps and appendices, you probably want to look at pages 341 to 561. So a lot of information, but really the goal of walking you through this is to help you engage with the material and then be able to provide your own feedback about what you're reading. And to do that, there is a housing element feedback form available on the city's website. If you go to beta.menlopark.org /housing element, and there's a lot of information about the housing element there. There's a meeting this coming Monday night, and again, today is May 14th, so the meeting is on Monday, May 16th at 7 p.m., and this is 2022, and it's a joint Housing and Planning Commission meeting where they're going to be going over the highlights of the housing element and providing feedback. There's going to be an upcoming City Council meeting to discuss this material as well. And then just keep in mind that the deadline to submit any of your feedback is Friday, June 10th. So like I said, we're in the midst of this 30-day comment period. So don't delay, read the housing element today. So you can continue to stay informed and engaged at the City of Menlo Park's housing element website, beta.menlopark.org /housing element. I also send periodic updates on important issues in the city, including the housing element, via my newsletter, which is you can subscribe to at jenwolosin.com/newsletters. And I just want to remind everyone that yes, there's obviously a great need for housing in our community, but at the end of the day, this is a state requirement. And the state has been implementing new enforcement mechanisms for this Cycle 6 housing element as part of a package of new state housing laws. So if our city fails to submit a compliant housing element, we could be subject to fines, fees, and disqualification of certain grants and funding. We could lose our local land use power, and we could receive a moratorium on all permits. So even if you want to do a kitchen remodel. So this isn't something that we kind of are doing as a voluntary exercise. This is a required state mandate. And so again, I think it's a matter of not if, but how and where will the new housing be added. And to remind everyone that we do need housing at all income levels throughout the city, because that affirmatively furthering fair housing component is a big piece of this cycle's housing element. So I will leave you with some thoughts that change is coming and change is hard, but with change comes opportunity. So it's a big lift that is ahead of us to add all this housing, but it does give us an opportunity to create a community that is more welcoming, more sustainable, where our kids will find an ice cream cone, hopefully near our homes, with the added vitality that will come. I think we'll have a community that we can all feel really wonderful being part of. So thank you for watching this. Thank you for being an active participant in our city's evolution, and happy reading. And please reach out if you have any questions. My information is everywhere. So thanks again.